Hello and welcome to Comic Island. My name is Arden and this is my top 10 worst things about all new Marvel. Well, we all had our fun when I tore the New 52 a new one. So now it's Marvel's turn. Hey! And it seems fitting because ever since DC's Rebirth has rolled out, a successful reboot that actually addressed many of the problems plaguing the New 52, including ones that I put on that list. Well, it seems like Marvel has been practically begging for their own. This is concerning all the recent titles they've been running for the last 5 years. Marvel Now, All New Marvel, All New Marvel Now, All New, All Different, Marvel Now .1, All New Marvel again for a second time, whatever they're doing, whatever they want to call it, it's all similar, it all suffers from the same problems, and will be the focus of today's video. Now in that time, a lot of great stuff has happened. I do want to make that clear. The examples of these easily come to mind. Miles Morales kind of grew into his own identity. Time Runs Out and Secret Wars happened. Moon Knight had a great one. And we got Ms. Marvel, a great, new, award-winning addition to the world of Marvel Comics. Not everything that happened during this time was wrong or bad. Nor can their works be written off as entirely a disaster during this time. But the setbacks are very much real and did build up to where we are today. They're not so easily dismissed either, especially in light of DC Rebirth showing that modern comics can and should be better than they are. They've been kicking Marvel's ass in sales lately, and there's a reason for it. And actually there's 10 reasons for it. We're about to get into them. And as always, I feel the need to remind the lovely world of YouTube that criticism does not equal hatred. I love Marvel, and nothing will change that. So with all that nonsense out of the way, let's get started with my top 10 worst things about all new Marvel. Number 10. Too much goddamn concern over the MCU. Let's start off by making something quite clear. I really like the MCU. I think it's one of the best adaptations of a comics there are, embracing all that is good about a shared meta-narrative, being surprisingly loyal to the source material and visuals from which these movies get their inspiration, and generally just being a fun series of movies, television, and franchise-related materials. It's a great experiment that isn't going away anytime soon, and honestly, to that, I have no complaints. Literally millions of people are now casually familiar with the Avengers, the Guardians of the Galaxy, and the Defenders. It's a wonderful thing and great for us avid comic book readers. But what should be an opportunity to get those people hooked on comics has largely been squandered in the last 5 years. This is because Marvel tends to approach these things all wrong. The way it should work is that we see movies like Guardians of the Galaxy and should be able to go and buy related current Guardians comics that further that need. That happens sometimes, but usually Marvel seems to want to force things the other way around. So instead of relishing in current successes, they use the comics to workshop new ideas, and worst of all, try and push future products onto us now. And thus we get the most obvious example of this problem. The Inhumans. You know, I actually used to like these guys, but only really as this peripheral aspect of the Marvel universe. It was a way to show how complicated and storied the Marvel world could be, but they never really offered characters that compelling to carry their own franchise. Or at least not one as big and significant as, say, the X-Men, who, again, Marvel seems really eager to try and gradually supplant with the Inhumans. And boy, has Marvel been trying, and I don't really get the trend. The comics can be a good way to try stories and see what works on a smaller scale audience compared to the much larger movie-going crowd. I get that, but the idea that selling us, the comic book audience, the idea of the Inhumans, will somehow, in some weird, hopeless way, make the movie sales for something that isn't happening for another 5 years minimum become a bigger success, well, the whole thing is a little bit silly. It means a lot of stuff has been forced down not only our throats as readers, but also that of creators. I recently saw a tweet by Rip Remender about that big Axis event he wrote a couple of years ago. Specifically, someone asked him if it was his decision to retcon Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver into Inhumans and therefore not the biological children of Magneto. His reply, a hefty no, really speaks for itself. So while writers have been forced to bend their stories around Marvel's incessant promotion of their already successful film franchise, the quality of the comics have suffered. Worse still, fans can easily sense the ever-encroaching creep of the MCU on the comic book continuity, and for the last 5 years or so, There's been a lot of sense of friction and bad blood brewing between the fan base and the company because of this and several other reasons we're about to get into. That's not good, but I do understand why they're doing this, and this problem is pretty obvious and a common complaint. That being said, yeah, I do get to a degree making your universe more like the MCU. That does help selling people on the comics through the movies. As such, this sits at the bottom of my list because it's an understandable problem, not nearly as bad as the stuff we're about to get to. Number 9. Custody battles. Closely tied to the last point is Marvel's ongoing hissy fit with Fox over the rights to make movies about the Fantastic Four and the X-Men. On the one hand, I can empathize with Marvel a little bit. Why should they essentially provide what they view as free promotion for these movies that Marvel has no control over and very little financial interest in? But once again, I think this is faulty thinking. The comic book readership compared to the movie audience is much smaller. You'll never be able to drive blockbuster sales through the comics, but what you can do is use the movies to draw readers into your comics. Yet once again, Marvel just doesn't get that, and they take a great opportunity and largely give it a solid pass. As such, the free advertising they could get from the X-Men movies, and the Fantastic Four, although not really that one, it really takes a back seat when it comes to promotion and the focus of the comics stories. This is why the Inhumans all too often get favored in these big events, while the focus has shifted the Marvel properties towards the MCU as much as the company feels they can get away with. But because the X-Men are so popular, this happens less than the Fantastic Four, who as of now are pretty much a relic of the past. I'm sure they'll be back one day, and it's not like Doom, the Thing, and the Human Torch aren't still present in the Marvel world, but more and more I find the company is turning away from what made their franchise great and trying to reinvent itself in a way that is more consistent with the film properties they own. Not only does it add to that bad blood I've already mentioned between reader and publisher, but it also goes a long way to explain the stagnation of X-Men comics and the outright rule the company has that prohibits most, if not all, new characters from being designated as mutants. It's had a very big impact on the ongoing meta-narrative of the comics for years now, and it can be one of the most frustrating aspects of Marvel. Because people aren't going to stop liking the X-Men under any circumstances. They aren't going to stop wanting to read those comics. So all you're doing is just squandering all this free advertising that the movies like Apocalypse and First Class and Days of Future Past are giving you. Both this and the drift towards MCU do stay at the bottom of the list though. First because, well, it's really not that big of a deal. Stories can be pretty much about anything, it's how they're executed that really matters. And if they can somehow make the Inhumans work, well, I'm all for it. From what we've seen so far, even a properly made Inhuman story just doesn't excite me as much as an X-Men one does. To put it mildly, one team is just plain more exciting, iconic, and cooler than the other. I don't really mind the idea of 3.5 companies having a comic book film franchise over just 2. What I can't abide by, what I won't accept, is Marvel passively aggressively working its frustration over all of this into the comics themselves. Why should we, as an audience, pay for the mistakes the company has made in the past? Number 8. Diversity. Marvel has a diversity problem. There's simply no denying it. Much like DC, this isn't entirely their fault so much as the ongoing problems of race and gender relations permeating society as a whole, and all that stuff. And while this doesn't excuse either company from the problem, it does inform it. However, unlike DC, Marvel's problem with diversity is a bit more nuanced. In other words, I definitely think Marvel has a diversity problem. I'm not exactly sure what that problem is. That being said, the overall situation is way better when we compare it to the New 52. For those who watched that video, I put this particular issue way higher on that list because I thought it belonged there. This is especially true given I happily have no seedy stories of alleged sexual misconduct to share from Marvel, which basically turns a potentially major problem into a relatively minor one. Which isn't to say nothing like that shady business has ever happened at Marvel. I have no idea if saying that for sure one way or the other. But even if something like that has happened, there's no evidence or weird cover-ups and crazy stories like we got out of DC. Which is, quite refreshing. Marvel is also in a way better situation when it comes to the demographic makeup of its characters. At this point, they've reached a pretty solid level of diversity. We've got characters, major and minor, from most walks of life. While the last 5 years have carefully dedicated themselves to quietly making all female characters realistically depicted and wearing clothing that makes, human sense. So Psylocke went from the queen of all wedgies to a badass woman in a ninja uniform. The ladies of Marvel weren't desexualized, but they were no longer gratuitous, except for characters like Emma Frost, whose personality meant, well, it'd be weird and kind of sexist to not dress her up that way, because that's who Emma is and wants to be. And unless you're, well, you know what, this is a pretty great thing. I have to say it's nice to know the ladies are now properly represented, not as pin-up models, but as warriors and soldiers, dressed out of function more than form. And the diversity thing is just nice, especially given how we live in a modern world where most groups are no longer so, white bread. I think Marvel has done a good job at making their American team of heroes look representative of a truly modern America. All that being said, there is something quite inauthentic with a lot of this diversity. For one thing, yes, just like how Marvel's been pushing the Inhumans and other nonsense, the changing demographics of Marvel's heroes does come across as a bit forced sometimes. It's one thing to introduce new characters. Miles Morales, Ms. Marvel, America Chavez, Nico Minoru, they're all great examples of characters with staying power that have been valuable additions to Marvel's roster over the last, 10 plus years or so. It's quite another when you make those big changes to the Avengers themselves. Doing so has been one of the many decisions that cemented a divide between the fans of old and the Marvel of today. Doing this, research has shown that they've survived this by, for every old reader they've lost, they've attracted 2 new ones. That's not necessarily a bad thing ever. There was always going to be some people who weren't willing to accept anything other than a pure white Marvel. I say good riddance to them. To paraphrase one commentator on this matter, you've had hundreds of white heroes for decades, why are you now throwing a temper tantrum because we're kind of getting a few more of color? Amen to that. But I do agree that, to a degree, these changes have been pushed a little too aggressively, and I can understand some people who argue this is really little more than tokenism. The argument has a particular degree of strength when we take a look behind the scenes and find, sure enough, the creative staff is pretty still heavily white and male. This is where the inauthentic nature of the diversity really begins to shine, because for all of Marvel's talk of change and progress, it really strikes me as mostly rebranding while the same old guard marches on. As always, these words will unleash a storm of the usual arguments, that the fact that the writers and staff of Marvel being this way are just a hilarious coincidence and I should be quiet. I think there's a genuine belief out there that Marvel gets a bunch of scripts from the script fairy and, blind to all racial and gender prejudice, pick the very best writers the world has to offer. The reality couldn't be farther from the truth. As a rule, neither Marvel nor DC accept solicitations except under rare and specific circumstances. Editors and scouts draw the majority of talent in, meaning that they pick among writers who are already active in the world of publishing. They pick. They don't do any weird auditions, they don't do anything like that. And that's the way it should be. These are the 2 biggest companies in comics. They do not need to hold auditions. So no, it's not just Marvel picking the best writers and them happening to be largely based on one creed and color. This isn't how the world works when you are one of the 2 biggest publishers in the world of comics. By sheer random sampling, if they were truly race blind, the demographics of the writers and artists wouldn't look like this. This was most evident when Riri, the new Iron Man, was announced, making her the 3rd of black female characters that currently headline a Marvel title. And that's a pretty great thing. Black characters and female characters individually are generally underrepresented historically, but combined, while there are some examples, it's very rare, and it's kind of a big deal for Marvel to be kind of opening up like this. But then a lot of people pointed out that Marvel has really never hired a black female writer, ever. Not once, ever, in 77 years. Even DC hadn't achieved such an embarrassing feat by 2016, and while that problem has been quickly and quietly fixed, that's still just kind of ridiculous. It's not like black women aren't out there to be recruited in the big wide world of literature. You can tell by how easy it was for Marvel to find heavyweight writers in the form of Roxane Gay and Yona Harvey, the first black female writers of this silly company who will be creating the upcoming comic Black Panther: World of Wakanda. I think it really symbolizes the ongoing problem with diversity within Marvel. It's very easy to change the color of some character's skin, but talent and recruitment require investment, and we just haven't seen that yet. And that's the diversity that really matters. I'm not saying that black characters need black writers and vice versa. In fact, I'd really like that to open up a little bit. We should have writers of all races and creed able to write for characters of all races and creed. So for all of Marvel's efforts towards diversity, and real progress has been made that should be commended, they are not perfect in this regard and do have steps that need to be taken to move forward. And maybe, just maybe, they could do it with a little bit more, we'll say creativity, and a little less force and ridiculousness. Number 7. Isaac Perlmutter. So there's something I go out of my way to do when making these lists, which is avoid calling out people too specifically. I'm usually reluctant to call out individuals with certainty because I have no way of knowing who does what. I don't and never have worked for either Marvel or DC. I have no special knowledge of what goes on behind those doors and can only speculate based on what I can glean from the media and the comics being published. You have to understand all of this because when I say Isaac Perlmutter is a major problem in Marvel, I say this with a reasonable amount of certainty at this point, but not complete certainty either. This is a problem I have become convinced of over time, yet, to be absolutely clear, I have no definitive proof. Okay? Okay. So who is this guy? I'm sure at least some of you have never even heard of him. Hell, I know that some of the people who watch these videos still somehow think that Stan Lee is in charge of Marvel, and he hasn't been for decades. No, for the last long while it's been this guy. And we're going to be holding on this picture of him for a while because it's the only one. Perlmutter is a bit of an oddball recluse, so there really isn't a ton of info on this guy. Yet, since 1995, this has been a major player in the world of Marvel Comics, and for a good chunk of that time, the CEO. Now a lot has changed since then. Disney obviously bought the company and thus now technically all major decisions are at their behest. And Perlmutter no longer has any direct control over the MCU, as Kevin Feige now personally deals with the higher-ups at Disney, which is very well deserved. This goes a long way to explain why the MCU movies have improved in the last couple of films, with healthier budgets and more of the actors who were souring on continuing with these movies suddenly much more open to the idea, because Perlmutter is not around to ruin everything. What we do know of this guy is not super promising. If the business surrounding MCU isn't evidence enough, the more we learn, the less things look good. He has a reputation of not being easy to work with and notoriously fickle. Feige has apparently expressed a lot of frustration with the guy. This goes a long way to explaining a lot of the conflicts behind the MCU in the early days, by the way. The reason why we still haven't gotten that Captain Marvel movie, and why Don Cheadle suddenly became War Machine, because, allegedly, according to Perlmutter, all black people look the same. Yeah, he's that kind of guy. Thank God for Feige then, but the news isn't good for the world of comics. This is the man who pushes the X-Men to the side and shoves Inhumans down our collective throats. This is the one who views minorities as interchangeable tools to better push product on the masses. This is a man who has no respect for you or the comic book industry. He is, as far as I can tell, poison to our geeky little world. If you want to see evidence yourself of what it must be like to work under this guy's company, you should check out some of the employee reviews of Marvel Comics on Glassdoor.com. It's an illuminating experience when you learn that the colorists for our comics regularly have to fight for the right to use toilet paper in the office. Perlmutter is also often attributed to the ongoing problems regarding the MCU TV shows, which are all still under his control, though it seems Netflix exists in their own little world and surprise surprise, look at how much better those are doing in comparison. Funny isn't it how everything Marvel this guy isn't involved in is totally awesome right now. What a strange coincidence. Learning about this man has really softened my stances on past and current editors-in-chiefs Joe Quesada and Axel Alonso, who no doubt have been trying to manage the guy's strange behavior for years now and doing the best they can. I am so sorry about Joe Quesada. I have blamed him for so many things that I've come to believe aren't necessarily his fault. But geez, if I had known he was working for this guy, I would have really given him a lot of benefit of the doubt. Because by the way, he's a really nice person. Every time I hear him speak, he's always got a real passion for comics and seems like a really likable guy. So yeah, these terrible decisions I might have once attributed to them have come into a very new light. Our only hope is that this weirdo eventually retires or Disney wises up and boots this guy to the curb like they should have a long time ago. Like the second they bought Marvel. The relative dip in sales these past few months compared to DC could be all the excuse they need, but these comics are a very small branch of a very, very large tree. I wouldn't put it past Disney, a company that has theme parks all over the world, multiple movie and television studios, and billion-dollar franchises to worry about, to overlook this little comic book publishing firm. And you can't really blame them. And if that's all the case, well, for now, we're kind of stuck with this guy. Number 6. Talent management. This one's kind of boring, but also very important. But yeah, after that whole toilet paper thing we talked about on the last part of this list, I think it's kind of self-evident. Treat your employees well, and they will treat the work the same way. Treat them badly, and well, they'll do their job, but you better believe they'll make a sprint to that exit door when they find a way out. This is the reality of those who work with Marvel, and while there are plenty of examples of productive relationships people have with the company, usually with writers who are popular enough and have enough clout to kind of set their own terms with them, most of the talent at the company tends to move on after a while. From what I've heard, the experience at the company is cool because you get to work with these awesome characters, but otherwise not a terribly positive experience. I mean, would you want to work at a company that makes billions where you have to fight to get basic office supplies? Managing talent is tricky but very important, because given that a lot of the staff need to be creative and energetic, it's worth the time and money to do this effectively. And Marvel just doesn't. So much great talent gets shed all the time, and we end up in this sort of vicious cycle of good people coming and going, while the mediocre have nowhere else to go, so they stick around. These are the terrible effects of turnover, something I've seen happen in many a workplace where companies suffer as a result. Worse still, not only does Marvel not provide ideal conditions for their employees to work in, but the creative staff have to deal with one editorial mandate after another. We've talked about a few already, like stuff Remender has had to deal with, and just the Inhumans in general, but let's move on to the next few items on my list, but keep this in mind what I've said here. Remember how for every one of these things, all the poor writers and artists have to work around the company's demands and fit them into their story, often to the detriment of the overall quality of work. With that in mind, let's move on to Number 5. Too many crossovers. Well, who didn't see this one coming? A similar entry showed up in the New 52, but that was a little different. That mostly referred to the wide-scale use of smaller-scale, dual or 3-title crossovers. For Marvel, it's quite the opposite, and the big company-wide events are what's really pulling the company down these days. Ever since the first Civil War, Marvel realized that big events can sell a lot of money with sufficient advertising, and they haven't really looked back ever since. It was bad enough when this was an annual thing, but about 5 years ago, some monster within the company, I have my suspicions, decided it would be a good idea to do these at least twice a year. That's cooled back down in the last couple years, but even then, ever since the big crossover event Avengers vs. X-Men, we've had Age of Ultron, Infinity, Original Sin, Axis, Time Runs Out, Secret Wars, Civil War II, and over half a dozen Spider-Man and X-Men events around all this. The result has been pretty devastating, filling every Marvel title to the brim with crossovers and giving them very little room to breathe in between all of this. So much so that Spider-Man and X-Men feel like they're just basically being shuffled from one big thing to the next, with very short spurts of filler in between. It's nice to have an interconnected universe, but if your main characters are never given a chance to live outside of these big events, then there's nothing to support the character's story outside of the big event. Spider-Man. The negative effects should not be understated. Right now, as I'm writing this, the writers and editors are writing up or have finished their tie-ins for Civil War II. They will have then a handful of issues at most before having to divert themselves again to the next big thing happening in January. A sort of monster theme event where all the giant big bad guys invade and the Marvel heroes have to deal with these Godzilla-sized monstrosities. That's actually really awesome, but man, we could really use a break from one event after the other. As I've said in my deconstruction of the New 52, crossovers can be beneficial, but only when they're used in moderation. When used in excess, they tend to become distractions from the story you want to read at the time. Unwatched diversions that tend to pull the readers out of the story. It's not good for us, it complicates the world of Marvel unnecessarily, and it just desperately needs to be toned down. I'm not saying it needs to go away entirely, in fact I wouldn't like that. But it does need to be done with a little bit more build-up and a lot more time in between events to give it significance. Look over at DC's Rebirth and how slow they've been at doing big company-wide events and crossovers in general. They learned their lesson and have not only been toning these down, but spacing them out a bit more, and the result speaks for itself. Readers are sticking around longer and aren't dropping the series as much as they used to. They have more staying power than what is typical for comics these days. Even if we look within Marvel, the slow build of Time Runs Out paid off much better than any other event that kind of just rushed along in comparison. It's something Marvel desperately has to fix, but sadly, by the looks of things, it isn't going to happen anytime soon. So stay tuned in December when Joey gets to cover Marvel's other next big event, Inhumans vs. X-Men. Hahaha, good luck with that. Although I'm calling dibs on that monster thing is so cool. Number 4. Soft reboots. So remember how I was saying at the beginning of this video about how all the different Marvel launches, the all new, all different Marvel Now .1 stuff, and how it all pretty much resulted in the same thing? Yeah, I don't know if you've noticed, but I haven't really bothered distinguishing much between these little reboots because there's literally no distinction to be made. It's all the same thing, except for each time it gives Marvel an excuse to roll out new #1 titles. This is done for a very simple reason. Comics with a #1 on them tend to sell a lot more. Except, as anyone who looks at these sales figures can tell you, that sales boost tends to only last for 1 or 2 issues before it drops back off to the regular viewership level. So Marvel thinks if they just keep rebranding themselves, they can at least enjoy the boost each year and make a little bit more money. Except this has diminishing returns because fans wised up to this trick pretty quickly. Each reboot usually follows one of the crossover events and whatever bag of changes Marvel's brain trust has dreamed up this time. This year it's 2 new Iron Men, and you know what, I don't even care what else. It's all the same, it all serves to confuse people by creating a half dozen different volumes for the same friggin' story, and it's all incredibly annoying. In a world where Marvel is confusing enough due to its layered continuity, crossovers, and other rapid-fire changes, these reboots don't help matters, and again, makes Marvel come across as very phony. It seems to be a recurring trick of the company to try and change its stripes without fundamentally changing itself. And it tends to lead to a lot of muddiness along the way. Number 3. Endless hype. Tied heavily into the last 2 points and the next one, Marvel accompanies all this crap with an endless, constant wave of hype. It's all they ever seem focused on and interested in. The next big change, the newest character, the next big event. One thing after another, constantly built up, and very rarely paid off. It turns into the boy who cries wolf situation. Every time Marvel comes running into the village and tries to sell us the idea that the latest thing is going to be the biggest thing that changes everything, and oh my goodness, you can't miss it! It's going to be the biggest deal since the last biggest deal 2 months ago! Pay attention to us! Pay attention to us! Please pay attention to us! And then of course the big trumped up event rolls up, and before it's even finished, Marvel comes running back into the village with new previews for the next big thing, and suddenly that's all that matters. Forget paying off the last big change or event. Forget anything, really, because it's all in the past and we have something new to get excited about, and this one's gonna be the biggest thing that ever happened since the last biggest thing. What happens after that? Well, you just repeat this over and over again, and there you pretty much have the marketing strategy for Marvel Comics over the last 5 years. Meanwhile, hype doesn't really do you, the reader, much favors. It tends to lead to disappointment, and the only one it really helps is Marvel. After all, hype is excitement and emotion, and emotions don't generally pair off with rational thought. Marvel, like many companies, uses hype to override your logic and get you to fall for the same tricks over and over again. To buy a comic before you think about whether or not you want to buy this comic. They are generally very effective at it, but not after doing it so much and so often. People are starting to see through the tricks, and as such, I've noticed Marvel can't quite grab headlines like they used to. I mean, you know what the biggest reaction to the 2 new Iron Men have been? Apathy. And who wouldn't feel that way at this point? I get it, the comics are constantly publishing while the movies only have to come and go a couple of times a year. But you can't live in a constant state of build-up. To effectively tell a story, you need to go through all the phases: setup, execution, payoff. And if you can't sell that, well then you can't sell stories. Number 2. Changes. Speaking of hype, let's talk about the root cause. The constantly shifting nature of Marvel's universe. I've dealt with it pretty heavily already, but it definitely deserves a spot all on its own right here. The Marvel universe is going through unprecedented upheaval over the last 5 years, and to say that is quite the understatement. The changes made following Avengers vs. X-Men Bringing in the all-new X-Men, Superior Spider-Man, and all the creative staff switching things up should have been more than enough change to sustain us for the last 5 years, but no. We got like 5 waves of huge shifts with the same level each time. And now I can't keep track of it all. I wouldn't be able to form a master list of everything that's happened. Tony was evil, but now he isn't, so I guess Sabretooth is evil again too? Have they affirmed that one way or another? Because I honestly have no idea. Cap got old and lost his powers, but then he got his powers back. But then it turned out he was remade into an evil guy. But wait, there's more to it than that. And also Old Man Logan is back, and so are some of the Ultimate characters, and now we have Gwen Stacy, and oh my god, this is all too much! I'm honestly losing track of things at this point, and the endless wave of Marvel constantly drumming out the latest change is getting borderline intolerable. I'm okay with stories changing, and I'm usually pretty open to them because stories are supposed to move along and develop. I'm all for it. But the key thing is you actually have to follow up on these changes. You want to make a new Captain America? That's cool, do it. But you're going to have to take the time to show this new Cap and how he deals with the world around him. I can tell you pretty much how every major character feels about Steve Rogers. Spider-Man admires him and his ability to bring out the best in people. Wolverine kind of shares a certain kinship with him, the sort you'd see between war veterans. The Punisher, well, that's a whole different story. But Sam Wilson, well, I know how Steve feels about him. I like the part where Rogue casually broke his arm during Axis. But that's all I really got for this new Captain America. This is also true for the new Thor, even now defunct changes like the Superior Iron Man or Spider-Man. We didn't and don't get to see how these changes meaningfully affect their relationship to the superhero community, and as such, these silly little stunts feel superfluous, fleeting, and temporary. Of course, part of the problem is that there are so many changes that have happened or are ongoing. Actually getting into depths of what this means for the superhero community would take like 10 years at this point if you wanted to keep the stories even slightly organic and natural. That's because these things take time as team-up and crossovers happen, and you can't force that. It needs to be done at a certain pace. Proper change can't be rushed, but you better believe people at Marvel are trying. Now, part of it I do get. The comics can be a great way to field test stories to see if they'd work on the big screen. This is in part why we see new alternatives for the big 3 Avengers. The actors who play Thor, Captain America, and Iron Man won't do so indefinitely. Even if they want to put it bluntly, people age. It just won't and can't last forever. So I get why Marvel is doing this. They're testing the waters and seeing what will work, replacing certain figures and all that. Inevitably, they will have to on the big screen unless they want to do a reboot, and I think we can all agree they're probably going to want to avoid that for as long as possible. But the fun part of comics is you don't have to worry about aging and the likes. And like it or not, we as a society just prefer Odin's sons, Steve Rogers and Tony Stark over Jane Foster, Sam Wilson, and Riri Williams. That's not to say these characters can't and don't have their value, I just kind of wish they had their own value, that they didn't have to piggyback on Thor, Captain America, and Iron Man. Doing it like this makes the comics feel forced, and often makes some of the stories fall flat or lose their weight, especially when it happens all at once. Change doesn't mean anything if it only lasts for like a year and a half. To really get into things, you need to invest time and dedication, and well, you've been listening to this video for a while now, do you really think Marvel Comics has a sense of either? And the number one thing wrong with all new Marvel? Chaos. When I wrote the new 52 list, I kind of had an idea of what the number one would be. The idea of editorial mandate was always kind of the central problem with me and DC over the last 5 years. And for a while, that was going to be the same for Marvel too. In the end, I scrapped that category entirely because it really feels like every single item on this list is a property of their editorial mandates. The movie stuff, the weird and downright deceitful approach to diversity, all the hype nonsense is just one form of Marvel's management over another. Except for this item. This is not something enforced by Marvel's editorial staff or management. This is the byproduct of their actions. And so it is chaos that floats up to the top of Marvel's list of shit. Because chaos is all we have left. Let me ask you, dear viewer, if you wanted to help somebody get into Marvel Comics these days, where on earth would you start? If I wanted to help somebody catch on to Marvel as it stands at this moment, I don't even know where I'd begin. I suppose if you really wanted them to get like the basics of everything in the modern world, and assuming that they already know the general idea of who the X-Men, Inhumans, Avengers, and Spider-Man characters are, you could maybe start around Decimation and Avengers Disassembled and work your way up to the present. That sounds awful, to be honest. There's so many terrible stories along that way. Some great ones too, but ugh, that just sounds terrible. Alternatively, you could try and start one of the many jumping on points Marvel concocted over the last 5 years, but I find those aren't nearly as helpful as Marvel makes them out to be. A lot of those stories start out half-realized and do expect you to be caught up on more recent events. Daredevil had like 3 volumes to it, but they were all pretty much the same ongoing story, so you couldn't start midway. And what results? Chaos, confusion, another synonym from the thesaurus. Look, I'm the kind of guy that started reading A Game of Thrones last year, and by now can tell you the entire history of the world of Westeros and the cause geography, from the land beyond the wall to the shadows of Ashai. I like worlds. I like complex, intermingled history with lots of detail and relationships between groups and figures. I can get behind that stuff and have a really good memory for it, which is why I like the big, wide worlds of Marvel and DC. But even I am getting lost in the sea of chaos that is modern Marvel Comics, and that is not a good sign. Blink and you miss hours worth of history. It's why Joey and I kind of fall out of funk with various aspects of Marvel occasionally, because it's just so hard to casually cover some of their stuff. This is the sort of problem that crept up on Marvel slowly and has snowballed into an abomination. Comics have always had this problem, but for the last 5 years Marvel has been feeding this beast. To prove my point, I picked out a character at random, Captain America, and I typed out everything you need to know about the guy to have a rough idea of where he is and what happened to him over the last 5 years. This is chaos. This is making your stories inaccessible to anyone but the most diehard reader. This doesn't even change the basic ongoing story beats. These are major things that happen to this character, and doesn't include anything in the past 5 years, including some pretty fundamental stuff about like the Winter Soldier, Falcon, and a bunch of other characters that play a huge part in the last 5 years' events. How is anybody supposed to stay on top of things when I could easily do this with any other character, and so much of this content plays into picking up a random comic book story and enjoying it? Ugh. We've reached the end. A couple of things to note. One, this is an awfully lot less hopeful than the New 52 video, oddly enough, mostly because a lot of those things were already being fixed and even more have been addressed since I made that video. They've gotten and are getting a lot better, but Marvel isn't showing such signs. Now money talks more than anything, and pretty soon someone there is going to get the message. You don't get people who independently track comic book sales calling Marvel's last few months embarrassing without some changes being made behind the scenes. Marvel has made some great strides and done some excellent work in the past 5 years, but they desperately need to move forward. They desperately need to get better. I will tell you one other thing though. That monster event, that sounds so cool. It's not exactly a big philosophical fix to Marvel's ongoing problems, but I can let a lot of stuff go next year if Doom gets to fight Fing Fang Foom. I'm just saying, you might actually win this round, Marvel. Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments section below, and if you like this video, we are happy to announce that Comic Island is officially starting a Patreon thing. If you want to subscribe, there are tons of great perks, including prioritized requests, extra bits of content, and other cool stuff. Plus you get to support us, and that's nice. Yeah, helpfulness. You can check it out in the video description below. Finally, don't forget to like, subscribe, and keep reading comics.
To the blind would be awful majestic. It would be the most beautiful thing that they ever had seen. It would cause such surprise, it would make all of their minds electric. How could anyone tell them that some things are not what they seem? In such disbelief I thought I was asleep when I met you. My heart liquefied and I sighed, oh, this must be a dream. If I forget to set the alarm and sleep on through the dawn, don't remind me. I'd rather be dreaming of someone than living